Welcome to session 74 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction. I'll tell you a little bit about this series just in case you're new to it in just a moment, but I don't want to delay telling you who we are going to be looking at and which books in particular. So it's N.K. Jemisin, a living author, and these are fairly recent works. We're looking at the Broken Earth trilogy, very imaginative, world-building, philosophical theme, introducing books right here, each of which is quite meaty and substantive and a lot of fun to read and quite thought-provoking. So we have the fifth season, the first in the series. We have the Obelisk Gate, the second in the series. And then we have the Stone Sky, the third in the series. And altogether they comprise this really interesting epic with lots of different characters playing a role, including the same character viewed from different perspectives, as we'll talk about just a little bit later on. So what is Worlds of Speculative Fiction? This is a monthly series that we have been running since 2016. It was originally held at the Brookfield Public Library, who gave us space. A lot of people became regulars and would come. We've got video recordings of every single session, so you can go back and check them out if you want to. And after the first year, I was invited back to continue the series. And originally, I did it so that I could do some guilty pleasure reading of science fiction and fantasy authors who I had really enjoyed back in my childhood, my teens, my 20s, but I hadn't read for quite a long time. And as the sessions went on, I started getting some great feedback from people, and they began suggesting who I should tackle next. And so I incorporated their ideas into it. Now, when COVID hit, we switched to this format after taking a couple months off to, you might say, find our way. We now do this online. I present for anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes, and then we have a Zoom session afterwards where we can have some fairly intimate conversation. But while this is running, you see that there is a live chat that you can write your comments in, questions. Try to keep them on topic because we want to discuss these particular works and the world building and the key themes involved in them. For new authors, that is new to the series, we typically spend some time doing a little bit of biography. We also will look at, if they're available, the things that the authors themselves have to say about their own work. And in Jemisin's case, we have quite a bit of that. And the emphasis on the series, or the emphasis in the series, rather, is on world building, and there's a ton of that going on in these novels, and on important philosophical themes, which might be metaphysical, they might be ethical, they might be epistemological, they might have to do with philosophy of technology, action, mind, all these things that fall within the range of philosophy. Why do we do that? Because I'm a philosopher, and so I'm particularly interested in that, but I think that you will get a richer experience out of reading these works, knowing some of the philosophical antecedents and analogies and themes that are woven into them. So we will be jumping into this. I'll talk a bit about the world building first, I think, just to wet your whistle, and maybe a little bit about character and perspective, that is point of view in these stories, because that's rather unusual as well. Then we'll look at Jemisin's biography, things she has to say about herself, and then we will jump right into a more robust examination of the world and the important philosophical themes that are explored, assumed, referenced, other ways of bringing them up within these three very interesting novels, Before we do that, I have to say a word of thanks to my friend, Joanne, who is somebody who was there for the Brookfield Public Library sessions, has continued on in our online format, and she is the one who for several years was suggesting you gotta read N.K. Jemisin and you gotta read the Broken Earth series. And I'd say, yeah, okay, I'll get to that. We had it lined up to do last year, but we didn't actually get to it. And so we are doing it this year. And I got to say, and I'm going to speak directly to the camera on this one, Joanne, thanks so much for persisting in suggesting Jemisin and specifically this series to me. As so often, you are completely right. It is great work. I can't wait to talk about it here and to explore it further in discussion with whoever wants to engage in that after this video premieres. So that is the thanks, the shout out, you could say, to a good friend of mine who is very interested, just as interested as I am, perhaps even more so, in speculative fiction, and who's been a great guide this entire time. So sit back and enjoy. We've got a lot of discussion to go through, but feel free to leave your comments and I'll respond to them in the live chat. If you're watching this afterwards, you can leave comments and I'll respond to those in the normal comments section. So, with no further ado, let's get started. N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy is presenting us with an incredibly rich world that she has built and allowed to develop out of her thoughts, as we'll find out later on when we look at some of the interviews. And I think that we have to begin with at least a summary view of what kind of world this actually is in a number of different important respects, going from geology itself to social organization and, thinking about the roles individuals can play within this, in this vast story. And, when I went back to the fifth season, it's very easy to forget where you started in the book. And so I think there's some great passages in this prologue that tell us quite a bit about this world. So she says, let's start with the end of the world, why don't we? Now, why begin with the end of the world? Because they are going into one of the fifth seasons in some of this book, and actually parts of it are happening later on when the fifth season has already begun. So what is a fifth season? You're accustomed to thinking of our four seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall, in an endless sequence. A fifth season is this incredibly disruptive, cataclysmic event that makes it possible for human life to be entirely wiped out from the planet. And we're actually going to find in the end of the story in the Stone Sky an appendix which charts out the different seasons. And by the way, the Obelisk Gate and the Stone Sky are mostly, except for flashbacks, taking place in this new fifth season that is going to happen. So a fifth season happening in the world on this continent, which is called the Stillness. And so we should begin where she begins. So N.K. Jemisin on the first page of the prologue says, here is a land. It's ordinary as lands go. Mountains and plateaus and canyons and river deltas as usual. Ordinary except for its size and its dynamism. It moves a lot, this land. Like an old man lying restlessly abed, it heaves and sighs, puckers and farts, yawns and swallows. Naturally, this land's people have named it the Stillness. It is a land of quiet and bitter irony. The Stillness has had other names. It was once several other lands. It's one vast unbroken continent at present, but at some point in the future, it will be more than one again, very soon now, actually. And she says, the end begins in a city, the oldest, largest, and most magnificent living city in the world. That's a very important point. And actually, let me just pause on that for a moment. One of the terms that gets used quite a bit is dead civ, meaning a former civilization that may have actually been more technologically advanced than the current civilization that they're living in, but which has died because of one of the fifth seasons and not being able to sustain itself over time. And the human race didn't die out, but all of these artifacts are left behind. So Eumenis is, at the time that this is being sort of written or being narrated, it's the greatest city in the world, but it is not the greatest city the world has ever seen. All right, back to her depiction. This city is called Eumenis, and once it was the heart of an empire. It is still the heart of many things, though the empire has wilted somewhat in the years since its first bloom, as empires do. Eumenis is not unique because of its size. There are many large cities in this part of the world, chain-linked across the equator like a continental girdle. Elsewhere in the world, villages rarely grow into towns, and towns rarely become cities, because all such polities are hard to keep alive when the earth keeps trying to eat them. But Eumenis has been stable for most of its 27 centuries. Eumenis is unique because here alone have human beings dared to build not for safety, not for comfort, not even for beauty, but for bravery. The city's walls are a masterwork of delicate mosaics and embossing detailing its people's long and brutal history. The clumping masses of its buildings are punctuated by great high towers like fingers of stone, hand-wrought lanterns powered by the modern marvel of hydroelectricity, delicately arching bridges woven of glass and audacity, and architectural structures called balconies that are so simple yet so breathtakingly foolish that no one has ever built them before in written history. But much of history is unwritten. Remember this. The streets are not paved with easy-to-replace cobbles, but with a smooth, unbroken, and miraculous substance the locals have dubbed asphalt. Even the shanties of Eumenis are daring because they're just thin-walled shacks that would blow over in a bad windstorm, let alone a shake, yet they stand as they have for generations. At the core of the city are many tall buildings, so it is perhaps unsurprising one of them is larger and more daring than all the rest combined, a massive structure whose base is a star pyramid of precision-carved obsidian brick. Pyramids are the most stable architectural form, and this one is pyramids times 5 because why not? And because this is Eumenis, a vast geodesic sphere whose faceted walls resemble translucent amber, sits at the pyramid's apex, seeming to balance there lightly, though its truth every part of the structure is channeled towards the sole purpose of supporting it. It looks precarious, that's all that matters. The Black Star is where the leaders of the empire meet to do their leaderish things, and there will actually be an entire caste devoted to leadership. The Amber Sphere is where they keep their emperor, carefully preserved and perfect. He wanders its golden halls in genteel despair, doing what he's told and dreading the day his masters decide his daughter makes a better ornament. None of these places or people matter, by the way. I simply point them out for context. So she's giving us a flavor of this land. And I'm going to skip forward a little bit, right? And there's this meeting with a stone eater, and we're going to talk more about them in a little bit. Stone eaters rarely bother stating the obvious, she mentions here, and what is going to be happening here. So the world is going to end because of what somebody's doing. And we get a depiction of this. Here is the stillness, which is not still even on a good day. Now it ripples, reverberates in cataclysm. Now there is a line roughly east-west and 2 straight, almost neat in its manifest unnaturalness, spanning the girth of the land's equator. The line's origin point is the city of Eumenis. The line is deep and raw, a cut to the quick of the planet. Magma wells in its wake, fresh and glowing red. The earth is good at healing itself. The wound will scab over quickly in geologic terms, and then the cleansing ocean will follow its line to bisect the stillness into two lands. Until this happens, the wound will fester with not only heat but gas and gritty dark ash. Enough to choke off the sky across most of the stillness' face within a few weeks. Plants everywhere will die. The animals that depend on them will starve, and the animals that eat those will starve. Winter will come early and hard, and it will last a long, long time. It will end, of course, like every winter does, and then the world will return to its old self eventually. The people of the stillness live in a perpetual state of disaster preparedness. They've built walls and dug wells and put away food and can easily last 5, 10, even 25 years in a world without sun. Eventually, meaning in this case, in a few thousand years. So, this is really quite important. Each of the communities, what they call a comm, has to revert to a different kind of status. They have to make sure that they can sustain their population, that they can battle against other comms for resources that become scarce during the middle of a season. Everybody has to hang together. And there are, of course, traders. There are, of course, people who sell others out in this broken, dangerous land that turns against them. And these people think of Father Earth, not Mother Earth, Father Earth, as being evil. They personify the earth as something like a god below who hates humanity. And here is where we get introduced to one of the key ideas. So how could somebody actually break the land himself? It's going to turn out to be Alabaster, one of the main characters, because he is an origin, or as they're called derogatorily, rogas. And these are people who have the power to do things with the earth. And as it turns out, not just the earth, but also water and air and all sorts of other things. They have an organ, a sespeninae, in the back of their brain that allows them to do these sorts of things. And they are hated and feared by the rest of the population, what are called the stills as opposed to the origins. And quite often they are lynched, they are butchered, they are massacred, they are discriminated against, they are hated, they are driven out of their communities. And there is a safer place for them, relatively safe, called the fulcrum, which is kind of a school. But as we're going to see, it's more than just a school. So we've got this very interesting civilization that is spread across an entire continent. And, they're progressing technologically, as we see, but they are beset by many problems, one of the biggest of which is the world, the earth itself that they live upon. Let's move on to one other really important feature. It becomes more and more important. When you first read it, you're like, this is interesting, but what's going on with this? While we're doing things continentally, planetarily, we should consider the obelisks which float above this. The obelisks had other names once back when they were first built and deployed in use, but nobody remembers those names or the great device's purpose. Memories are as fragile as slate in the stillness. In fact, these days, no one really pays much attention to the things at all, though they're huge and beautiful and a little terrifying. Massive crystalline shards that hover amid the clouds, rotating slowly and drifting along incomprehensible flight paths, blurring now and again as if they're not quite real. Though this may only be a trick of the light, it's obvious that the obelisks are nothing natural. It's equally obvious they're irrelevant, awesome but purposeless. Just another grave marker of just another civilization successfully destroyed by Father Earth's tireless efforts. There's many such other cairns around the world, 1,000 ruined cities, 1 million monuments to heroes or gods no one remembers, several dozen bridges to nowhere. Such things are not to be admired, goes the current wisdom in the stillness. The people who built those old things were weak and died as the weak inevitably must. Most damning is that they failed. The ones who built the obelisks just failed harder than most. Now, we're not going to actually know what she means by that until we get really into the third book. It's a prescient phrase right there. So these are some important features of the world as we find it. But we have to say more about what's going on. So the Rogas, the Origins, right? They actually can serve an important purpose if they can be taught, if they can be tamed, if they can be harnessed. They can help to stabilize this world that people are trying to live in. But they're always considered to be dangerous, so everybody else distrusts them. And just to give you an idea of something that's going on in this world, we have Sanine and Alabaster, these two really important characters, traveling along, and Alabaster is going to introduce her to what the node maintainers are really doing, right? So let me read a little bit to you here. Rusted, reeking earth, high roads are dull. Most people think they're death traps waiting to be sprung, despite the fact that they're usually safer than ordinary roads. All imperial roads were built by the teams of the best geoengineers and origins, deliberately placed only in locations deemed permanently stable. Some of them have survived multiple seasons, so for days at a time, Sanine and Alabaster encounter only hard-driving merchant caravanners, mail post riders, and the local quarton patrol, all of whom give Saonite and Alabaster the eye upon noticing their black fulcrum uniforms and do not deign to speak to them. There are few comms lining the route's turnoffs and almost no shops at which to buy supplies, though there are regular platforms along the road itself with prepared areas and lean-tos for camping. Cyan has spent every evening swatting bugs beside a fire with nothing to do but glare at Alabaster and have sex with him, but that only kills a few minutes. They're actually like being placed together to create super origin children because Alabaster is a 10-ringer, meaning the highest rank that you can be. So they go on, and Cyan asks, "What are you doing that for?" After she noticed him quelling microshakes. So as they're traveling along, they can feel what's going on in the earth, and they can amplify it, they can redirect it, they can quell it, as Alabaster's doing. He's done it just again now while they wait for dinner. He yawned as he did it, though of course it must have taken some effort. Origin always costs something. And so they're talking about this, and he says, "I'm giving the node maintainers a break. Every microshake I settle eases the burden on them." Cyan knows of the node maintainers, of course. As the imperial roads link the former vassals of the old empire with Eumenes, so do the nodes connect far-flung quartons with the fulcrum to extend its protections as far as possible, all over the continent. At whatever points the senior origins have determined it best for manipulating nearby faults or hotspots, there is an outpost. Within that outpost is stationed a fulcrum-trained origin whose sole task is to keep the local area stable. In the equatorials, the node's zones of protection overlap, so there's nary a twitch. This and the fulcrum's presence at its core is why Eumenes can build as it does. Beyond the equatorials, though, the zones are spaced to provide the greatest protection for the largest population, and there are gaps in the net. It's just not worthwhile, at least not according to the Fulcrum seniors, to put nodes near every little farming or mining comm in the hinterlands. People in these places fend for themselves as best as they can. Cyan doesn't know any of the poor fools assigned to such tedious duty, but she's very, very glad no one has ever suggested it for her. It's the sort of thing they give to origins who will never make it to fourth ring, the ones who have lots of raw power and little control. At least they can save lives, even if they're doomed to spend their own lives in relative isolation and obscurity. And then she says, maybe you should leave the micros to the node maintainers. Earth knows they probably need something to keep them from dying of boredom. So what we have here is a picture in her head, which is going to be dispelled shortly, that these node maintainers are, basically the equivalent in the old days. We'd say, like, you're going to be stationed at an army post in Alaska. There's just nothing around. It's boring as hell. But you've got a job to do. Or it's sort of like being a forest ranger up in a fire tower, just looking out every day to see if there's fires and then doing something about it, directing people there. Except in this case, they don't have to, like, call somebody to put out the fires. They put out the fires themselves. They prevent the earthquakes. They prevent the slippages, all these sorts of matters. The true nature of the node maintainers is rather horrific, as we find out. So they go into one of the nodes, and they find the node maintainer in a chair. He's seated in it, and we find out the body in the node maintainer's chair is small and naked, thin, its limbs atrophied, hairless. There are things, tubes and pipes and things, she has no words for it, going into the stick arms, down the goggle throat, across the narrow crotch. There's a flexible bag on the corpse's belly, attached to its belly somehow and full of, the bag needs to be changed. She focuses on all this, all the little details, because it helps, because there's a part of her that's gibbering. And the only way she can keep that part internal and silent is to concentrate on everything she's seeing. Ingenious, really, what they've done. She didn't know it was possible to keep a body alive like this, immobile, unwilling, indefinite. So she concentrates on figuring out how they've done it. The wire framework is a particular bit of genius. There's a crank and a handle nearby, so the whole apparatus can be flipped over to facilitate cleaning. The wire minimizes bed sores, maybe. There's a stench of sickness in the air, but nearby is a whole shelf of bottled tinctures and pills. Understandable, because it would take better antibiotics than ordinary calm-made penicillin to do something like this. Perhaps one of the tube things is for putting that medicine into the node maintainer, and this one is for pushing in food, and this is for taking away urine. Oh, and that cloth wrapping is for sopping up drool. She sees the bigger picture, too. The node maintainer, a child, kept like this for what must have been months or years, a child whose skin is almost as dark as alabaster's, and whose feature might be a perfect match for his if they weren't so skeletal. It's all she can say. Sometimes a Roga can't learn control. Now she understands that his use of the slur is deliberate, a dehumanizing word for someone who has been made into a thing. It helps. Sometimes the guardians catch a feral who's too old to train, but young enough that killing's a waste. And sometimes they notice someone in the grit pool, one of the especially sensitive ones who can't seem to master control. The fulcrum tries to teach them for a while, but that if the children don't develop at a pace the guardians think is appropriate, Mother Sands can always find another use for them. And then she says, as this underfires Alabaster, I know children who are taken off to the nodes. I didn't. This doesn't. Alabaster unstiffens. She hadn't realized how stiff he was holding himself until he bends enough to slide a hand under the boy's neck, lifting his oversized head and turning it a little. You should see this. She doesn't want to, but she looks anyway. There across the back of the child's shaved head is a long, vining, keloided scar embellished with the dots of long-pulled stitches. It's just at the juncture of skull and spine. Roga cecipinae are larger and more complex than those of normal people. When she's seen enough, Alabaster drops the child's head. It's a simple matter to apply a lesion here and there that severs the Roga's self-control completely while still allowing for its instinctive use, assuming the Roga survives the operation. Ingenious, yes, a newborn origin can stop an earthshake. It's an inborn thing more certain than a child's ability to suckle. And it's this ability that gets more origin children killed than anything else. The best of their kind reveal themselves long before they're old enough to understand the danger. But to reduce a child to nothing but that instinct, nothing but the ability to quell shakes. So he goes on, and what do we find? Many of these are actually Alabaster's own children. So there's this, horrific sacrificial, we could call it utilitarian in a certain way, aspect to maintaining control over the earth that would otherwise be constantly in flux and creating more and more dangers to human life. And this is what they're taking human beings, who they dehumanize, treat as mere objects, into these tools. They turn, think about Aristotle's dictum of the slave as a ensouled tool. That is what is happening here. There's other things that we should say about this world, and it is becoming, not just a broken earth at one point in time, but in the rest of the story. Part of the fifth season and the rest of the trilogy, the Obelisk Gate and the Stone Sky, are in the fifth season, where the world now has been genuinely shaken up and comms are on their own. And Eumenes has been effectively destroyed along with so many other big cities. And the question is, what are these people going to do? How are they going to survive? And we find all sorts of different models for how this takes place. There's one comm that attempts to dominate and take over all the others. As it's going to turn out, that one is going to be destroyed in a way that we'll talk about that has to do with the obelisks. Another is one where Roga's origins are actually welcome, and at least part of the time, and it's within a gigantic geode, which requires origins to make it function over time, to keep it stable and keep the air flowing and all of that. There's yet others where the Guardians, at least some of them, are gathering and have their own origin charges. We have all sorts of interesting configurations, but the key to all of them is survival. And so I think that gives you a good picture of this world that we're entering into. There is one other thing that we do need to talk about before, looking at Jemisin's bio, some of the interviews, and then philosophical themes, and that is how the narrative itself is structured. One of the matters that we do need to explore from what appears to be purely literary set of preoccupations, but I think are arguably also philosophical as well, is the narrative structure, the way in which Jemisin is telling this incredibly intricate and quite literally global story that we find in the Broken Earth trilogy. And so we should begin with the fifth season, where there are three, let's call them point of view characters, and we're going to get more as time goes on with the other stories. And what's really peculiar about this is that, and here I'm going to give you a spoiler, so forgive me if you haven't read the text, there are three women. Well, one is actually a girl, and after we get through the prologue that I've already mentioned, we'll talk about who's actually talking in the prologue. We get introduced to one of them, Esun, right, who is 42 years old. Her son has been killed by her husband. Her daughter has been taken as well. And the world is beginning to fall apart for her and everybody else because the season is upon them. And she is one of the main point of view characters. It begins in chapter 1. You are she is you. You are Esun. Remember the woman whose son is dead. You are an Origine who's been living in the little nothing town of Tiramo for 10 years. Only 3 people here know what you are, and 2 of them you gave birth to. Well, one left who knows. Now, for the past 10 years, you've lived as ordinary a life as possible. You came to Tiramo from elsewhere, and it goes on from there. And that Esun is one of the main characters throughout the entire story. And notice that it is second person, right? And this is something that Jemisin chose to do, knowing full well that quite often, second person is not viewed as an appropriate way to present things. And, third person, first person, we're more accustomed to that. Then in chapter 2, we get another character. It reads this way: "The straw is so warm that Damaya doesn't want to come out of it. Like a blanket, she thinks through the bleariness of half sleep. Years ago and before she died, Madir worked for the Brevard militia as a seamstress and got to keep the scraps from any repairs that required new cloth. The blanket she made for Damaya was mottled and dark." This is talking about her grandmother. And what ends up happening is Damaya is taken by this person who she thinks is probably a child buyer, right? And it turns out that he is going to be a very important character, her guardian, right? What strikes Damaya most are the child buyer's eyes. They're white, or nearly so. She can see the whites of his eyes, and then a silvery gray disc of color she can barely distinguish from the white even up close. And he tells her, that I'm your guardian. And he is going to introduce himself as Shafa Guardian Warrant. So now we've got a second character, right? And this little girl is being taken away. Shafa will explain what a guardian is. He's taking her to the fulcrum because she's an origin. So we've got two different origin characters here. And then we're going to get, in the next one, this is a little bit later on, a third important character who is going to be mentioned. We have a bit more of Essun, and here we go in chapter 4, entitled Cyanate Cut and Polished. "This is shit," Cyanate thinks between the shield of her pleasant smile. She doesn't let the affront show on her face, nor does she shift even minutely in the chair. Her hands, 4 fingers ringed respectively in plain bands of carnelian, white opal, gold, and onyx, rest on her knees. They're out of sight below the edge of the desk. And Cyan is being commissioned to do something, and she's going to be assigned a mentor who turns out that she's actually supposed to produce children with as well. And so she is from the fulcrum, and it looks like we have 3 different distinct characters going on, 2 of which are talked about in the third person, 1 of which is talked about in the second person. And the big spoiler, of course, is that they are all the same human being, just at different points in the story. So the first girl becomes the young woman who's in her powers, meeting Alabaster, who then becomes Essun, who's going to be the main, let's say, consolidated character of these 3 throughout the other 2 novels. Now, in the second novel, The Obelisk Gate, we continue with the second-person narration, and it's now Essun who is involved in all these things, but we get 2 other really important points of view as well. One is her daughter, Nasun, right? And it begins first by saying, "I'm telling this wrong. After all, a person is herself and others. Relationships chisel the final shape of one's being. I am me and you. Damana was herself and the family that rejected her and the people of the fulcrum who chiseled her to a fine point. Cyanite was Alabaster and Inan and the people of poor lost Alia and Miav. Now you are Tiramo and the ash-strewn roads walkers and your dead children and also the living one who remains, whom you will get back. That's not a spoiler. You are Essun after all. You know this already, don't you?" Nasun next then. Nasun, who is just 8 years old when the world ends. And it says, we can speculate about her. And then it begins, narrating her story. And she's going to become a major character throughout this book, the Obelisk Gate and the Stone Sky. As a matter of fact, she and her mother are going to strive for control over the obelisks and decide what to do with this vast power, as it turns out that they possess. And then we also get the Guardian, Shafa, who is going to be eventually connecting with Nasun and working with her. So here's another chapter. Yes, you are him too, or you were until after Miav, but now he is someone else. The force that shatters the Klasu is orogeny applied to air. It goes on. Shafa knows what's coming the instant he feels the obelisk's pulse. He is old, Cyanite's guardian. He is so old. He knows what stone eaters do to powerful orogenes whenever they get the chance, and he knows why it is crucial to keep orogenes' eyes on the ground and not the sky. He's seen what happens when a four-ringer, that's how he still thinks of Cyanite, connects to an obelisk. He does genuinely care about her. You realize it isn't all about control. She's his little one, and he's protected her in more ways than he knows. And what ends up happening is he doesn't die, but part of him is damaged. There's nothing in his lungs. The air has been beaten out of him. He's trying not to inhale water. He has so much to do, but he's only human mostly, and the terrible pressure grows, and spots of blackness encroach on his vision, and his whole body grows numb with the weight of the water, and he cannot help sucking in a mighty lungful. He panics. And then there's something that says to him, if you wish to live, that can be arranged. O evil earth! More offers, promises, suggestions, and their rewards. Shafa can have more power enough to fight the current, the pain, the lack of oxygen. He can live for a price. Something burns at the back of Shafa's skull. We all do what we have to do, comes the seducer's whisper, and the cold presence takes him. Shafa can no longer remember everything. He's become damaged. He's in thrall to the evil earth, but he resists, and he becomes a major point of view as well, until he and Nasun come together, and then their stories effectively merge. Now, in the Stone Sky, we get another incredibly important point of view, and the beginning of it kind of gives this away, right? It starts... The time grows short, my love. Let's end with the beginning of the world, shall we? We shall. It's strange, though. My memories are like insects fossilized in amber. And he goes on and he says, in these memories, I was someone else, just as the stillness was some world else. Then and now, you and you. And who is this? This is actually Hoa, the stone eater who will become attached to Essen, who is in love with her eventually. And we find out that the Stone Eaters were originally human beings, transformed into stone by what they did to the earth, including taking away its moon. And he says that I'm going to tell you the story of Sil Angast. I'm going to let you know what happened. A city built wrong by your standards. And he talks about himself as a boy staring through the window at the winking flowers, a young man really, superficially mature in an ageless sort of way. Yes, this boy is me. I don't truly remember his name, but I remember that it had too many letters. Let's call him Hoa. The same sound, just packed with all manner of silent letters and hidden meanings. And he goes on and he says that the apocalypse is a relative thing. When the earth shatters, it's a disaster to the life that depends on it, but nothing much to Father Earth. When a man dies, it should be devastating to a girl who once called him father, but this becomes as nothing when she has been called monster so many times she finally embraces the label. This is talking about Nasun, right? And he goes on and he says, I will tell you the way that the world Sil Angast ended. I will tell you how I ended it, or at least enough of it that it had to start over and rebuild it from scratch. I will tell you how I opened the gate and flung away the moon and smiled as I did it. So he goes on and says, I will tell you everything of how later as the quiet of death descended, I whispered, right now, and the earth whispered back, burn. So we get Hoa, the Stone Eater, as a point of view character now as well, and he's the one who tells the story of the past. And Essen is, by the very end of it, going to be turned into a Stone Eater herself, and it turns out that the narrative framework for the entire set of novels is Hoa after Essen's transformation, after the world has been essentially saved, telling the story back to her, and we are in on the storytelling. So that's the narrative structure. Quite imaginative, quite innovative, isn't it? It's often illuminating to get an author's own words, their own point of view on the works that they spent so much time developing, as well as other topics. And so I think it can be quite useful for us to look at some of Jemisin's recent interviews, particularly those that are talking about the Broken World trilogy, but some other things as well. So I want to begin with an interview from Lightspeed, which we're going to look at a little bit of and then come back to a bit later. So she's asked, tell us a bit about what some of the books were that really got you interested in fantasy and science fiction. And Jemisin, interestingly, says, I was a giant fan of Tanith Lee, of Octavia Butler, of C.S. Friedman, kind of all over the place in terms of my interests. But I've also mentioned in other interviews that I read a lot of mythology, especially as a child and as a teenager. And then she's asked to follow up, how about those authors you mentioned? What are some of the things about their work that really drew you to them? So she says, I like the way that Tanith Lee played with conceptualizations of good and evil, and also the way in which, in a lot of her work, she emulated that sort of ancient, epic style. So, for example, with the Knight's Master, Death's Master, I can't remember what that series is called, but it felt very oral tradition recorded on paper, even though you knew that she'd made it up. But she was able to capture the feel of stories that have been passed down and stories that had grown apocryphal with retelling and things like that. I like the way that she played with the concept of who the hero was. You started off with, I think, Azarn as the first book's protagonist, who's a terrible person, well, a terrible god. Over the course of the story, you started to see so much more complexity to them. Then with Octavia Butler, I like the darkness of her science fiction. The fact that she really just did not pull any punches when it came to really depicting not just scientific implications if aliens showed up, not just depicting the way that the world would change, but depicting the way that people would react to those changes, which was something I really had not seen a lot of in science fiction to the point that I started reading her. You see the usual science fiction, it's Star Trek, we're all going to go and meet these aliens, and we'll get along with them relatively well, or we might shoot a few, but for the most part we'll have a decent relationship. Really no discussion of, what about us? Are we going to get ourselves together in order to meet these other peoples? And Butler's take on that was, maybe, with a whole lot of mess in the way, and I love the fact that she did not pull punches on that. That was refreshing for me at the point that I encountered her. So I think this is very interesting and revealing, isn't it? Showing you where she's drawing from. Then in the Clarke's World interview, a magazine where she's published as well, she's asked about one of the main characters. Much of Essen's journey is told in the second person, something we've talked about a little bit already. What made you choose this perspective? She says, well, there's a couple of reasons, one of which will not become clear until probably the third book of the trilogy. So that piece I can't talk about. But the other piece is simply that I wanted something that felt simultaneously distant and intimate. I wanted readers to identify with Essen, and second person actually interferes with that identification. When you play a video game, you're effectively acting out second person, but you're reminded at every turn that this is not you because you see a sprite on the screen. It's similar for a book. You're reminded at every turn that this character's name is Essen, that this character's interests and thoughts and beliefs and feelings are not yours. Naturally, the tendency is to resist identifying with her. But if you're watching someone go through hell and she's asking you to identify with her via that voice, you have a choice. you can reject it or empathize. So that's a very interesting point, too. There's a deliberate, let's say, motive behind this use of the second person, this very unusual writing style. Then she's asked again, the various plot threads and perspective characters throughout the 5th season reveal societies that harbor fear and prejudice, especially for the Orogens, people who can manipulate the earth. How does fear play a part in oppression? And Butler says, oppression is all about fear. It's about greed for what other people have and finding reasons and creating a framework to make it okay to take what they have. Whether what they have is their land or their lives, that's what it comes down to. The systems that help to maintain oppression are all about avoiding payback for that. There's this ongoing fear on the part of those who have incurred some kind of great karmic debt to get what other people have. They're going to have a comeuppance. In Western culture, that's the case. Western culture is all binary and about good and evil and retribution and things like that. I haven't studied other cultures as much as my own, but I do see a lot of fear, even in other cultures' experiences of oppression. Possibly that's because we deal with Western oppression globally, even though it takes different forms and moves through different lenses. Even when looking at historical examples of oppression, I see a bent around making sure the people who've had something taken from them continue to feel like it's right to have these things stolen. Then, Electric Lit. One of the joys of reading the 5th season was the way it was structured, seeing the ways in which the different subplots came together. They're told in different ways, including in the third and second person. How did you end up deciding to structure it in this particular way? So following up on that narrative perspective question, Jemisin says, I read pretty widely, not just fantasy. So I don't feel particularly wedded to the genre conventions. Fortunately, my publisher has been supportive in letting me explore, and my readers have been supportive in buying these books so I can continue to explore. I think that's because the fantasy audience is not just interested in formula, as I think a lot of popular wisdom would have people believe. The experimental stuff that I've done is not that different from what a lot of the great and enduring novels in the genre have done, and things that end up changing the genre have done. I don't think of it as being particularly unusual. The second person piece, I don't know where that came from. I often write test chapters when I'm first starting the novel, when I'm playing with a character and trying to figure out what her voice or his voice is going to be. I wrote a test chapter in the second person on a whim, and it worked, and I decided to keep doing it. There's no explanation beyond that. I was really interested because second person generally doesn't sell too well, and a lot of readers are sort of hinky about it, so I guess we'll see. And then they change topic. We get a sense of some of the communities and internal politics of the stillness over the course of the 5th season. Did that generally come up as you were writing it, or was there a reference that you had figured out ahead of time? And N.K. Jemisin says, both. The necessity of keeping track of little bits of culture and world and so forth. I've experimented with using a personal wiki and things like that before. In this case, I just wrote a crap ton of notes. I have a list of all the seasons. I have a list of the glossary terms that became the glossary. I always have to keep track of the various made-up words that I use. I made a map. I'm not a map girl. I don't like maps. I'm apparently infamous within the genre for being bizarrely hateful on maps, but finally I had to make a map. I had to know what the geography would look like, and I needed to know what the fault lines were and things like that. I wanted to show a society that was shaped by its environment and was shaped by the disasters that had preceded it. As I was working on these things, the rest of the world just started to gel. It was kind of necessary because I needed a societal structure within which these things would happen. And the societal structure needed to show all that history that I had built in. I wanted to show a society that was shaped by its environment and that was shaped by the disasters that had preceded it. All of that came out of me thinking, this is a society that periodically loses power, loses water, and where it's very difficult to maintain central control. The society would not be top-down authoritarian except on a superficial level. Local control would be crucial. They would have structures in place to cause each community to close within itself and become its own enclosed, self-supporting world for a while. So all that went into figuring out, how the society worked. They abandon capitalism during the season because they know that's a danger. It's a great way to end up with part of your population starving, and the community doesn't have enough people to survive and eat, and then you die. So they turn to a kind of hardcore communist for a brief period of time, or authoritarian, totalitarian for a period of time. The flexibility of the society is something I had to put together, and the rigidity of it was also there. It needed to be visible too. I just played around with it. And then we learn more about her world building that's really quite interesting when she's asked this question. The structure of different characters' names is also interesting. The way that the significance of them became apparent over the course of the novel. And then Jemisin says, well, that's standard fantasy genre stuff. World building is a central tenet within any secondary world fantasy. Reference to J.R.R. Tolkien's on fairy stories, and of course Ursula K. Leguin's From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, working off of that, this notion of secondary creation and secondary worlds. So she goes on and says, the readership expects and demands that level of detail. There are people who will make role-playing games in a heartbeat out of your books. And if you haven't provided them with predictable structures and things like that, they are going to get really pissed at you. And that can be helpful because it makes you drill down to a level of verisimilitude that most people don't want to think about. That can create a world, I love this phrase, with a really great lived-in feel if you do it right. Of course, it can also be a crutch, because you're still obsessed with creating mechanistic magic systems, which is almost an oxymoron. That can be played as a Dungeons & Dragons game. You forget it's magic. It's not supposed to make sense. It's a balancing line. Then she's asked again, the fact that manipulation of fault lines in the novel also involves lowering the temperature because of how energy is involved struck me as very interesting and resonant detail. And Jemisin says, the idea was that I wasn't going to use the word magic. Now, that's going to change in the later novels, right? But she goes on and says, why would they call it that? Why would they treat it as something different from the way their world works? It's the laws of physics there. It's science for them, so they use scientific terminology. They quantify to whatever degree they can. They treat it mechanistically. They train mechanistically. They do everything they can to systematize it. It's not systematizable, and they recognize that past a certain point, but that won't stop them from continuing to try to explore and understand it, any more than not understanding how the universe was created has stopped us from trying to figure out the age of that star over there and that sort of thing. In this case, I'm doing a secondary world whose people don't need to emulate myths. They're creating their own. They are living their own myths. This is the Iliad that they're going through, and then some stuff. That's what I was trying to come up with. For the people who are living through the impossible, it isn't impossible because they're living through it. I wanted it to feel like that. Finally, she's asked another really interesting question. Over the course of this book, Esson has to make some incredibly horrific decisions and is still capable of doing horrific things to people. How do you balance making her relatable while still making her a complex figure? Jemisin says, I don't know yet. Now, this is, of course, before she writes the other books. My hope is that because I'm exploring her in full, I'm delving as deeply as possible into her. You're seeing why she makes these horrific decisions. For me, that's always been a thing that helps. We're dealing with a literary landscape in which women have to be likable to be popular, but I'm not necessarily going for popular. I'm going for keep my career alive. I don't need to be a bestseller. I'd like to be, but I don't need to be. I know that in a lot of cases, women characters are expected to be nice or to be likable, and I know that I'm not going to be able to keep Esson likable because she's not in a likable situation. And she's got to make horrible choices, as you said. So all I can do is show that there are reasons for those choices. And those choices take a toll. She's not doing it out of callousness or cruelty. She's doing it because she's backed into a literal corner in some cases. And all that is taken in some cases from real-world events. Lightspeed interview, we pick up again. She's asked, we mentioned that the series was called The Broken Earth. This novel is called The Fifth Season. Do you want to explain what these titles mean? And she says, the Broken Earth Trilogy is something I literally just came up with. I told you I'm bad at naming. I was trying to think of a name for the series. My editor asked for a complete synopsis, and I was like, something about rocks, earth, stones, broken stones. No, that doesn't sound right. And that's how I came up with that. With The Fifth Season, though, it's the name of a phenomenon that occurs in this world. The fifth season is set in a world which, for various reasons, every few years or so, there's an extinction-level event. And she goes on and explains what they could be. This is a society, at one point a globe-spanning society, but they developed a system of preparing themselves for these events, which they call fifth seasons. In that system, whenever a season is declared, whenever they notice, hey, the sun hasn't come out for like 3 months and we're starving, they declare seasonal law, and every small community turns itself into a self-sufficient survivor community, and they store massive amounts of food against that eventuality that this will happen. They build walls, they keep their population small, and they separate themselves into groups of essentially castes based on usefulness. Then she's asked, do you want to talk about the magic system in this world? And she says, basically there's people in this world that have the ability to control seismic energy. They can trigger earthquakes, they can stop earthquakes, they can shut down a volcano, channel all that heat into water or something else. They're tremendously useful in this world, but the catch is they use energy to do these things. And when there's already an earthquake or volcano going off, they can use the energy of that. When there's nothing happening, though, they drag energy from the ambient, from everything around them, including the heat and kinetic motion of living things. So they kill a lot of people. They're called orogens, and this is a fantasy mutilation of a real word. The science of orogenesis or orogeny is the processes through which mountains are created. I thought it was a cool word, so let's turn it into a fantasy word. She goes on, so these orogens have this ability. There's more magical elements to the story than the orogens, but the story focuses on orogens and how they're treated by their society, which both values and is terrified of them and tries to control them. It does so in a lot of cases by essentially enslaving them. But other pieces of the story are these giant obelisks floating around in the sky. Nobody really knows why, but they're big, shiny gemstones that seem to be flickering in and out of reality. There's also a non-human race in this, which is my attempt to take the idea of the mythological creatures you see in a lot of fantasy and create a set of mythological creatures from scratch. Instead of making elves or dwarves or whatever else we're used to seeing, I wanted to create something new. These creatures are called stone eaters, and they look like statues, like very realistic classical statues, human features and so forth, but they're alive. And they can transit through stone, and they can do a lot more than that, but I don't want to get into spoilers. Then she's asked this, and I think this is very a good question to bring up, particularly, given the possibility of thinking about other similar stuff. So we get, you mentioned a lot of the novel, first novel, focuses on the way orogens are treated by their society, and they have this kind of magical academy called the Fulcrum, and I was wondering if you could talk about, obviously there's magical academies in Harry Potter and Earthsea. Could you say a bit more about how the Fulcrum compares to the magic schools we see in other kinds of fantasy? Now, this is an amazing answer. It's evil, Jemisin says. That's the simplest. Okay, I don't want to get simplistic and binary here and talk about good and evil, but it is very much a part of the system of oppression that they're put in place. Orogens are not permitted to exist unless they are products of this fulcrum, and I will go long here and just sort of point out that I'm a great, giant BioWare, Mass Effect, and Dragon Age fan, and I will say that this was probably influenced. I didn't realize until I was halfway through the first book, but this is influenced by Dragon Age's mages and mage circles. There's other places in fantasy and science fiction where I've seen similar systems put in place, but in this case, it's small children, or basically anyone before their teens, if they're caught and found to be an orogen at that point. It's an essentially random thing. It just pops up in the populace wherever someone has this ability. They lock up with it or unlock up with it, whatever you want to call it, and a group of people called guardians will come and get them and take them to the fulcrum. At the fulcrum, they learn how to control their ability. If they learn how to control it well enough, then they become imperial origins, and they're dispatched to various places on the continent to seal volcanoes and help stave off the coming of the next fifth season. They're trusted to do this because they've learned how to control their power. They'll never kill anybody by accident, that sort of thing. But if they don't learn it well enough, they're simply killed. The system cannot abide those who are not good at learning or those who are not obedient. And so it's how a lot of systems of oppression work. It's also inspired partly, you probably heard, reservation schools and schools to which indigenous people on multiple continents, not just a North American thing, but also Australian, and so forth, where the children of indigenous people were snatched away and sent to these places where they weren't permitted to use their own language, and they are forced to acculturate to white society, because it almost always happened in European colonized places, forced to acculturate on pain of death. And in some cases, well, it wasn't overtly said it was on pain of death, but in actual practicality, a lot of kids died in those schools. So there were a lot of influences in this, but I was thinking about the ways in which oppression tends to work. It's not always a case of an evil overlord coming in and saying, I'm going to make you my slave. In a lot of cases, you've got people complicit in the system who are part of it themselves. The fulcrum is run by origins, and you see it's not a kind or gentle place despite that. Fantasy literature interview, moving on. Kevin Way says, let me say congrats on your recent Hugo win. We wanted to start off by talking about how you write. I know you've said in the past your writing process differs depending on what you write. Has the way you've written Broken Earth differed significantly from the way you've written other works? Was there a large difference between the writing processes for the fifth season and the second book, The Obelisk Gate? Jemisin says, my process is still pretty much the same. At the planning stage, I outline and will put together different sets of information storage. Like at one point I used to use a wiki. Now I just write notes. I've got a file that's nothing more than stone lore I've made up, and another file that keeps track of all the seasons, file that keeps track of the way the plate tectonics would have moved over the years. But I think the difference now that I'm writing book 3 of the trilogy is I am now completely off the outline. I've been pantsing it almost exclusively, which is not normal for me, and I'm not sure what that's going to mean. I think it's mostly that I'm working at speed right now, and I'm working at such speed, I don't have time to even slow down to check my outline and make sure I'm track. It's a fairly simple story at this point. All the place settings have been moved, and the chessboard is all set up now. It's just a matter of now fight. And then they say, that sounds very exciting. I know you've said you needed a big break, a bit of palate cleanser after book 1 due to how dark the world of the stillness is. Do you need another one in between books 2 and 3? And Jemisin says, well, I did take one, but it wasn't a big break. It was like a couple months, and I didn't need it in the same way. Really, what I think is, I've finally gotten used to the bleakness of the world. Also, it's okay when you're doing something about the horror. It feels easier than if you were just wallowing in it. Then she's asked, let's talk about your most recent work, The Obelisk Gate. There's a moment when Nasun realizes her father has turned completely against her, and you wrote that her heart breaks in this moment, another small, quiet tragedy amid so many others. It is a manipulation, and from now on, all her acts of affection will be calculated, performative. I thought this was a really tragic moment. How is the reader supposed to feel about this? Jemisin says, well, I think it's telegraphed in the text that it's a tragedy, that it is the nature of abuse and certain types of oppression, that they force kids of certain types to grow up faster than they would necessarily than they should. This is the harm that's done by it. It damages you literally from childhood up. And she says, it's a common thing for origin children. They all have that moment. You see multiple children throughout the Obelisk Gate, and you see the ways in which they're all scarred, sometimes overtly, sometimes more symbolically, but they're all scarred, realizing that the people in their lives can't be trusted and hate them and will turn on them. She goes on, again, she's asked about concealment, about hiding, and she says, I think what I'm getting at there is this phenomenon, especially among African Americans, but you see it among other races where it's possible, of passing. I'm really just touching on the fact that people who are capable of passing are not wrong. If you've got a choice between living and someone trying to kill you and people sending you off to an abusive school and all the horrible things that happen to you, it makes perfect sense to avoid that. The catch is that people who couldn't avoid it will hate you, and they will have that resentment towards you because you didn't suffer something they suffered. You suffered something different, and that's the recognition that Essen doesn't ever get, which is that it must have been hard for Cutter to hide himself, to constantly worry about discovery. All of that must have been its own hell, but she's not there. She's thinking about what she suffered as the main hell. I was just really touching on that. It's hypocritical, but Essen came to that after a full lifetime of finding herself and getting herself together. Imagine having to hide as a child when you don't even know what you're hiding from and you don't know yourself. It does a lot more damage than she thinks it does. Then she's asked about Hoa, the Stone Eater character who we get introduced to early on in the Obelisk Gate. And she's asked, there are these parts of the story where Hoa is narrating in first person. You've discussed in the past why you chose second person and how you wrote the fifth season to make us feel sympathetic towards Essen. Are these first person sections with Hoa meant to do something similar? And she says, to draw people closer to him? No. If people by book 2 haven't started to engage with Hoa, then they're not going to. All I wanted to do is illuminate that he's a person, which I think I did by depicting him as a flesh and blood person before revealing his true self. He's not as enigmatic feeling, or I hope he's not as enigmatic feeling as the other Stone Eaters, but they're all the same. I want people to think they've all got stories. They're all in the eye of a tale somewhere. And she says, he's pretty human anyway. A lot of the things I'm trying to do in this story is get past people's initial impressions, readers, as well as the characters. I talked about this in one of my blog posts about how with Essen, she's a middle-aged woman. She's what we would call black. She's violent-tempered. She's got PTSD that manifests as wiping out cities every once in a while. She does horrible things over the course of the story. A lot of people are going to look at that on a superficial level and immediately be like, I'm not interested in this character. I can't identify with this character. So this is why, with the first book, I took people through showing how she became what she is and hopefully getting people to identify with the character. Same with Hoa. Hoa is terrifying when you really think about it. Creepy. He's supposed to be. But on the other hand, in book 3 in particular, we're going to see how Hoa became what he is. So he's still going to be creepy, but on the other hand, you may understand him and you may be able to empathize with him. If people can empathize with the average character in fantasy, they should be able to empathize with a character like Hoa. There's no reason why they shouldn't be. It's just a matter of how well I manage to bring it across. Then she says a little bit later, what I think to some degree, what I'm trying to engage with is that fantasy tendency to try and justify oppression. You see it again and again in fantasy that this one group of people over here are mistreated, but there's a good reason for it. As in the Obelisk Gate, as in Dragon Age, they're mistreated, but it's because they're actually dangerous, and I wanted to interrogate that. In my series, the reasoning is that the Origins are more dangerous than other people because, boom. But throughout the story, you see evidence that there's different responses people could have from that. One of the responses they could have is snatch them away from their parents, kill them if they get out of control, shove them into this terrible place where they're forced to learn how to control themselves, the fulcrum. The other is to leave them with their origin parents so they learn from people who love them and have the skill to help them. Don't traumatize them. There's a lot of different responses people could have to realizing you've got this group of people among you that's different. You could accommodate that difference. You could find a way to wrap your society around that difference and make it healthier and safer for everybody instead of shoving some into a horrible place or genociding them. What I keep wanting to show is that people think that the idea that a group of people is legitimately different and therefore it's legitimately okay to discriminate against them. This is not really the question that should be being asked. The question that should be being asked is, why aren't you more willing to accept these people's difference. Going on to the Paris Review interview, she's asked, what are the pasts you draw upon and the futures you want to see? Jemisin says, the pasts that I draw upon tend to be mythic pasts. I'm not super interested in writing historical fantasy. I've done that a few times in the case of subject areas I felt should have been explored more, like the Haitian Revolution, for example. But for the most part, I'm more interested in exploring the gods we could have had, or these are the creation myths that we could have explored. I'm not super interested in existing mythology, though existing mythology does inform just about everything I'm coming up with. But that's more along the lines of, this is how mythology should be structured, so you need to look at existing mythology to understand that. If I'm trying to come up with a secondary world, the goal is not to use too much of the existing world. I tend to prefer secondary worlds to the existing one. And she says, if I'm writing a novel set in New York City in the modern day, I've got to research every little detail, mostly because my friends all live here and will give me all kinds of grief if I get it wrong. It's a lot easier writing the secondary world. You don't have to do as much research. You can wing it a little bit more. And she goes on and says, science fiction has always said it strives for a future for all humankind. Most science fiction does not depict futures for all humankind, though. In a lot of cases, when it tries to do so, it does this by a kind of hand-waving. We get to those shiny, happy utopian futures. Star Trek, for example. In Star Trek, in the future, everybody can be part of the Starfleet. Supposedly, all of humanity has access to good education, good food, all that other stuff. And yet, Starfleet is still dominated by middle-class, middle-American white dudes. So something happened along the way, clearly. There's only one Asian man, and Asian people represent the bulk of humanity now. That's crazy. She's talking about the original series there, right? And then she's asked, in an interview with Ursula K. Le Guin, she eschewed the label of science fiction and called herself a novelist and poet instead. Maybe it was how she was feeling that day, but have you ever felt that label of science fiction is a pigeonhole? And she says, no, because it hasn't been for me. Maybe because I'm a black woman, there's an automatic assumption I'm somewhere in the margins of science fiction, in the margins of fantasy, and therefore people from outside the genre's margins are a little bit more willing to take a look at me, even though I'm writing solidly science fiction stuff. But the Broken Earth series has gotten the attention that it has, in part because I tend to use literary techniques as well. And that's just because I don't care. I'll use whatever techniques are necessary to get the story across, and I read pretty widely. So when people kept saying, second person is just not done in science fiction, I was like, well, they said first person wasn't done in fantasy, and I did that with my first novel. I don't understand the weird marriage to particular techniques and the weird insistence that only certain things can be done in science fiction. And then she goes on and says, in a lot of cases, people read science fiction and fantasy when they're younger and then they age out of it. Fantasy in particular, they get tired of the endless Tolkien clones. They get tired of stories where an elf, a dwarf, and a halfling walk into a bar. They're not bad, but you see the formula, and you've seen the formula a couple of times, you get tired of it. There's always people within the genre who are perfectly happy with that formula, and they seek out that comfort food every time they read, but a lot of readers move on. I believe at least a few of my literary readers are ex-genre readers who had left basically in a huff, tired of the formula, and came back because something I'm doing speaks to something they want. There's a change that's been happening on a number of different levels. There's more literary-style writers in the genre. There's more writers who are willing to be inclusive, whether they themselves are representative of different races, cultures, ethnicities, or not. I may be one of the more visible representatives of it, but I'm not the only one. And then she's asked, and this is where we're going to end, about justice. What do you want people to know about justice? And she says, most of us grew up on fairy tales in which there was quick and fair and obvious justice. Or at least we were told it was quick and fair and obvious. At least a lot of the fairy tales that we grew up on had really disproportionate justice. Like, did they really have to burn the wolf? I suppose they did. Or did they really have to murder the witch who tried to eat the children? Well, she did try to eat them, so tit for tat. A lot of the fairy tales that have retired over time posited a kind of justice we no longer think of as just. We don't have good fairy tales for the justice system we're currently living in. We've been told the police are your friend. If you did something wrong, you'll be punished. If you didn't do anything wrong, the system will set you free. None of this is true. This is not the justice system we're living in, at least here in the United States. And if you're black, then all bets are off. I think that on some level, that is where fantasy writers, and to some degree science fiction writers, tend to be trying to create the fairy tales that we need to survive. The world is pretty unjust right now. Those of us who've grown up on the short end of the stick understand this innately and want acknowledgement of that reality, because so much of American society is dedicating to weaving the illusion that what you see is not actually what is happening. The endless excuse-making is part of our mythologizing these days, but fixing that is part of the job that science fiction and fantasy can do. That's one of the things that I believe this genre is ideal for accomplishing, if it chooses to. So, a lot of great stuff in these interviews, a lot of interesting themes to think about. Now let's delve into some of these philosophical themes in a little bit more detail. One of the key and deep philosophical themes that is running throughout the entire Broken Earth trilogy, and indeed throughout a lot of Jemisin's works, we're actually going to reference a short story from How Long Till Black Future Month in order to unpack this, is the, let's call it the nature and the many-facetedness and the reinforcements of evil among human beings. And you could say it's not just one single thing that leads human beings to hate, to exploit, to fear, to dominate. And these things all get wrapped up together. They take many forms. The ruptures within individual relationships, what happens over generations, the splits within societies themselves. And we really get to see that what's going on in this world that she's depicting has to do with a previous time in that world before the shattering, before the creation of the Stone Eaters, when human beings were living in a pan-continental civilization. And nevertheless, although they occupied something almost like a utopia, they couldn't get it right. And they wound up having to engage in things that they told themselves weren't evil, but actually were quite evil, as we'll look at in a moment. But I think that it could be quite useful to take a very quick look at this first short story in How Long Till Black Future Month, called The Ones Who Stay and Fight. And in interviews, Jemisin has said, well, this is clearly a reference and response to Ursula K. Le Guin's short story similar to this, Those Who Walk Away from Omelas. If you're not familiar with that, you probably want to check it out, because it is an amazing piece, one that I actually use to start conversation in my ethics classes. And it has to do with the notion of a just, a fair, a tolerant, a fully developed society, and whether some suffering is the price of that, some suffering imposed on one who can't even understand that. And Jemisin has said, well, she actually has a reference to Omelas right here in this. She says, this is Halat, and not that barbaric America. This is not Omelas, a tick of a city, fat and happy with its head buried in a tortured child. My accounting of Halat is an homage, true, but there's nothing for you to fear, friend. So what is this city like? She talks about it on the day of a festival, and she says, joyous, it is a steady joy that fills this city, easy to speak of, but most difficult to describe accurately. I see the incredulity in your face. The difficulty lies partly in my lack of words and partly in your lack of understanding, because you've never seen a place like Halat, and because I am myself only an observer, not yet privileged to visit. And she says, how can I illuminate this? It's a city whose inhabitants simply care for one another. This is a city's purpose, they believe, not merely to generate revenue or energy or products, but to shelter and nurture the people who do these things. And then she talks about the variety. The citizens in are so many and so wildly different in appearance and origin and development. People in this land come from many others, and it shows in sheen of skin and kink of hair and plumpness of lip and hip. And she goes on and she says, there's history rather than malice in the differences, and it's still being actively, intentionally corrected. Because the people of are not naive believers in good intentions as the solution to all ills. There are no worshippers of mere tolerance here, no desperate grovelers for that grudging pittance of respect which is diversity. Haladians are learned enough to understand what must be done to make the world better, and pragmatic enough to actually enact it. She goes on and she says, does that seem wrong to you? It should not. The trouble is that we have a bad habit, encouraged by those concealing ill intent, of insisting that people already suffering should be afflicted with further unnecessary pain. That is the paradox of tolerance, the treason of free speech. We hesitate to admit some people are just evil and need to be stopped. And that's where she talks about barbaric America and Omelas. And going on a little bit further, she says, how can such a city possibly survive, let alone thrive? Wealthy with no poor, advanced with no war, a beautiful place where all souls know themselves beautiful. It cannot be, you say. Utopia. How banal. It's a fairy tale, a thought exercise. Crabs in a barrel, dog eat dog, oppression Olympics. It would not last, you insist. It could never be in the first place. Racism is natural. So natural we will call it tribalism to insinuate that everyone does it. Sexism is natural, and homophobia is natural, and religious intolerance is natural, and greed is natural, and cruelty is natural, and savagery and fear and impossible, you hiss. Right? And she says, well, clearly I've offended you if that's your mindset about these matters. And she goes on and she says, Halat has actually been a worse place in the past. The city had a different civilization once, one which might not have upset you so much. Remnants of that time dot the land all around the city, ruined and enormous and half broken. Right? And she goes on and says that Haladians must be reminded of these things upon coming of age and told carefully curated stories of their nature and purpose. When the young citizens learn this, it's a shock almost incomprehensible in that they literally lack the words to comprehend these things. Right? And they go on and talk about the descriptive terms that they use for themselves. And then she says, these are just words, friends, don't you see, without the attached contempt. Such terms have no more meaning than if horses could proudly introduce themselves as Palomino, a miniature, or hairy-footed. Difference was never the problem in and of itself. And Haladians still have differences with each other of opinion and otherwise. Of course they do, they're people. But what shocks the young citizens of Halat is the realization that once those differences of opinion involved differences in respect, that once value was ascribed to some people and not others, that once humanity was acknowledged for some and not for others. And now the story changes. They talk about listening to our world on equipment that bridges these dimensions, right? Watching our television, following our social media, right? And time flows the same in both worlds, but people there have not wasted themselves on crushing one another into submission, and this makes a remarkable difference. And so people listen to our stuff and then become, in a certain way, contaminated by it. And so we have social workers, and the social workers go around and find these people, and what do? They kill those who indulge themselves in this. This is part of the price of having that semi-utopian society. And there's a vignette here of a man who's gets a pike through the heart, a very quick, merciful death. And his little daughter is standing over him, and she says, "I'll get back at you. I'll make you die the way you made him die." This is an unthinkable thing to say. Something is very wrong here. She snarls, "How dare you? How dare you?" And they are posed with a decision. They're going to, take her on, and she will be in quarantine. And if they accept the hand, listen to them, they will try to explain why her father had to die. She's eager for the knowledge, but something must be done. Then they will bury him with their own hands in the beautiful garden that they tend to. It holds all the Haladians who broke the law. Just because they had to die as deterrence doesn't mean they can't be honored for their sacrifice. And then Jemisin goes on. There is only one treatment for this toxin once it gets into the blood, tooth and nail, spear and claw, up close and brutal. No quarter can be given, no parole, no debate. The child must grow and learn and become another social worker fighting an endless war against an idea. But she will live and help others and find meaning of that if she takes the woman's hand, right? And so what do we have depicted here? A very different way of living, one in which difference does not produce dehumanization. Very different than what is going on in these works. And I think it would be good, actually, to begin sort of at the end, because we find out in The Stone Sky where the Stone Eaters came from. They were originally, we could say, the progenitors of the origins, those who are hated, feared, discriminated against, brought into the fulcrum, lynched, assassinated, harnessed, because there was something else going on before that. So we have this civilization, right? And then here's the story. The stillness in these days is three lands, not one. Their names, if this matters, are Maekar, Kakiar, and Silar. Sil Angus started out as part of Kakiar, then all of it, then all of Maekar too. All became Sil Anagist. Killer to the south was once a small and nothing land occupied by many small and nothing peoples. One of these groups was the Thnis. It was hard to say their name with the proper pronunciation, so the Siliganistines called them Nis. The two words did not mean the same thing, but the latter is what caught on. The Siliganists took their land, the Nis fought, but then responded like any living thing under threat, with diaspora, sending whatever was left of themselves flying forth to take root and perhaps survive where it could. The descendants of these Nis became part of every land, every people, blending in among the rest and adapting to local customs. They managed to keep hold of who they were, though, continuing to speak their own language. Even as they grew fluent in other tongues, they maintained some of their old ways, too. And while they lost much of the distinctive look that came of isolation within their small land, many retained enough of it so that to this day, ice-white eyes and ash-blue hair carry a certain stigma. You see now. But the thing that made the Nis truly different was their magic. Magic is everywhere in the world. Everyone sees it, feels it, flows with it. In Sil Anagist, magic is cultivated in every flower bed and tree line and grapevine draped wall. Every household or business must produce its share, which is then funneled away in engineered vines and pumps to become the power source for a global civilization. It is illegal to kill in Sil Anagist because life is a valuable resource. The Nis did not believe this. Magic could not be owned, they insisted, any more than life could be, and thus they wasted both by building, among many other things, plutonic engines that did nothing. They were just pretty or thought-provoking or crafted for the sheer joy of crafting. Yet this art ran more efficiently and powerfully than anything the Sil Anagistine had ever managed. How did it begin? You must understand that fear is at the root of such things. Nis people looked different, behaved differently, were different, but every group is different than others. Differences alone are never enough to cause problems. Sil Anagist's assimilation of the world had been over for a century before I was ever made. All cities were Sil Anagist. All languages had become Sil Anagistine. But there are none so frightened or so strange in their fear as conquerors. They conjure phantoms endlessly terrified that their victims will someday do back what was done to them, even if in truth their victims couldn't care less about such pettiness and have moved on. Conquerors live in dread of the day when they are shown to be not superior, but simply lucky. So when Nice magic proved more efficient than Silvanagistine, even though Nice did not use it as a weapon, this is what Kaleni told us. Perhaps it began with whispers that white Nice irises gave them poor eyesight and perverse inclinations, and that split Nice tongues could not speak truth. That sort of sneering happens, cultural bullying, but things got worse. It became easy for scholars to build reputations and careers around the notion that Nice, Cisalpinine were fundamentally different somehow, more sensitive, more active, less controlled, less civilized. And this was the source of their magical peculiarity. This is what made them not the same kind of human as everyone else. Eventually, not as human as everyone else. Finally, not human at all. Once the Nice were gone, of course, it became clear that the fabled Nice Cisalpinine did not exist. Silvanagistine scholars and biomagistrates had plenty of prisoners to study, but try as they might, no discernible variance from ordinary people could be found. This was intolerable, more than intolerable. After all, if the Nice were just ordinary human beings, then on what basis had military appropriations, pedagogical reinterpretation, and entire disciplines been formed? So what we see here is sort of an allegory, but also the narrative of this world as well, right? An allegory for the types of oppression and hatred and reading the other as different, as being lesser, as perhaps not even being human, but also as being a great threat that has to be controlled and corralled. And what do they, in fact, do? Well, they take the descendants of the Nice and they harness them. They turn them into tuners. They also charge the obelisks by taking the Nice and essentially lobotomizing them and putting their life energy into matrices. And so we read here, this is much later on, this is what the Silvanagistines truly made us for, to affirm a philosophy. Life is sacred in Silvanagist, as it should be, for the city burns life as the fuel for its glory. There are many ways to honor life, aren't there? Let's pause on this for a moment. You could honor life as something intrinsically worthwhile in itself. You could also view it as a resource to be exploited. And in the people that you already view as inferior, why not use their life? Why not harness their dangerous magic? So we go on and we see the Nice were not the first people chewed up in its maw, just the latest and cruelest extermination of many. But for a society built on exploitation, there is no greater threat than having no one left to oppress. And now, if nothing else is done, Silvanagist must again find a way to fission its people into subgroupings and create reasons for conflict among them. There's not enough magic to be had just from plants and G-engineered fauna. Someone must suffer if the rest are to enjoy luxury. Better the earth, Silvanagist reasons. Better to enslave a great inanimate object that cannot feel pain and will not object. But this reasoning is still flawed because Silvanagist is ultimately unsustainable. It is parasitic. Its hunger for magic grows with every drop it devours. The Earth's core is not limitless. Eventually, if it takes 50,000 years, that resource will be exhausted too, and then everything dies, right? And so what do we have going on here? Silvanagist, this civilization, is exploiting these people who they've marginalized and oppressed for generations and generations. And now they're going to tap into the earth itself. And this is going to generate incredible conflicts. And so we come back to the 5th season. There's a few sections from this that I want to bring up. So the Origines and the Guardians What is going on? Well, we see that Damaya is told this interesting story by Shafa, her guardian, right? That the origin of the guardians is in this need to control the origins and keep them from taking power within the empire. And so he says, as the fulcrum is an order of origins, we are the order that watches the fulcrum. For as we know, despite all your terrible power, you are not invincible. You can be beaten. And she likes the story. She imagined herself as Shemshena, the hero, right? Bravely facing a terrible foe and defeating him with cleverness and skill. With every you and your that Shafa speaks, however, she begins to understand. This is a little girl who has orogenic powers. He does not see her as a potential Shemshema. And so we guardians train, he continues, perhaps not noticing she's gone still. We train as Shemshena did. We learn how orogenic power works, and we find ways to use this knowledge against you. We watch for those among your kind who might become the next Misalems, and we eliminate them. The rest we take care of. I am your guardian now, and it is my duty to make sure you remain helpful, never harmful. So that tells her exactly where she stands. If she gets out of line, the guardians will kill her. And why is this being done? So we learn in her conversation, well, this is a different character who is the same person, of course, right? With Alabaster, the 10-ring origin. Cyanite is told by Alabaster, she's talking with him, and he says, we could try letting origins run things, and she laughs. That would last for about 10 minutes before every guardian in the stillness shows up to lynch us with half the continent in tow to watch and cheer. And he says, they kill us because they've got stone lore telling them at every turn we're born evil, some kind of agents of Father Earth, monsters that barely qualify as human. She says, yes, but you can't change stone lore. Stone lore changes all the time, Cyanite. He does not say her name often either. It gets her attention. Every civilization adds to it. Parts that don't matter to the people at the time are forgotten. There's a reason Tablet 2 is so damaged. Someone somewhere back in time decided it wasn't important or was wrong and didn't bother to take care of it, or maybe they even deliberately tried to obliterate it, which is why so many of the early copies are damaged in exactly the same way. So he goes on. The Archaeomess found some old tablets in one of the dead cities on Tapeta Plateau. They'd written down their stone lore too, ostensibly to pass it on to future generations. But what was on the tablets was different, drastically so, from the lore we learned in school. For all we know, the admonition against changing the lore itself is a recent addition. And so then he goes on, he says, Jemisin goes on, it makes her not want to believe him, or maybe that's her dislike for him surfacing again, but stone lore is as old as intelligence. It's all that's allowed humankind to survive through fifth season after fifth season. The lorists tell stories about what happens when people, political leaders or philosophers or well-meaning meddlers, try to change the lore. Disaster inevitably results. So she's questioning him, and then she says, well, what's actually the case then? And this is where we get to some other important stories. I also did want to share a little bit from the Obelisk Gate with you. Before that, though, we should say something about why the stone lore being changed matters. Because the stone lore is a fixed part of the culture that, seems to have some sort of purpose behind it. This is how you survive the seasons. And it gives you a map of where things are. So the origins are evil. They're in league with evil Father Earth. As it turns out, they're actually the opposite of that, right? They're not allied with the Earth. The Earth is their greatest enemy. So I did want to bring up one other thing. So the father-daughter conflict that's been brewing throughout the Obelisk Gate comes to a culmination when Jija, the father of Nasun, tries to attack and kill her. And what do we find out going here? So, in this scene, right, he says, sweetening. It's the voice he usually uses for her, but she knows it isn't real. His eyes are as cold as the ice she left all over his house a few days ago. His jaw is tight, his body shaking just a little. There's a knife in his tight fist. It has a slight iridescence that completely disguises the razor sharpness of its napped edges. Hi, Daddy, she says. And then she says, Mama's alive, Daddy. If the words mean anything to him, it doesn't show. He just keeps standing there looking at her eyes in particular. She's always had her mother's eyes. Suddenly, it doesn't matter. Nasun sighs and rubs her face with her hands. As weary as Father Earth must be after so many eternities of hate, hate is tiring. Nihilism is easier, though she doesn't know the word and will not for a few years. It is what she's feeling regardless, an overwhelming sense of the meaninglessness of it all. Why that meaninglessness? Because of all the irrational, though explicable, hate and prejudice and misunderstandings getting in the way of her own relationship with her parent, who's, by the way, killed her younger brother once he discovered that he was an origin. She says then, I think I understand why you hate us. I've done bad things, Daddy, like you probably thought I would. I don't know how to not do them. It's like everybody wants me to be bad, so there's nothing else I can be. She hesitates, then says what's been in her mind for months now unspoken. She doesn't think she'll have another chance to say it. I wish you could love me anyway, even though I'm bad. She thinks of Shafa as she says this, though, her guardian. Shafa, who loves her no matter what, as a father should. And then she says to her father, I'm sorry, Daddy. I tried to keep loving you, but it was too hard. And he attacks her, and she transforms him into stone, although he does manage to hit her as well with his knife. So, I mean, this is a sort of one of many demonstrations of what this irrational hatred and fear fostered by generations of culture and encounters and experiences looks like in this novel. And so this is a good place, I think, going from the sort of universal down to the particular to bring this exploration of the theme of human evil to a close and go on to think about some others. Our examination of the Broken Earth trilogy is already a little bit over time, or let's be honest, quite a bit over time at this point, but there is one other major philosophical theme that I think is well worth exploring, and it brings together a number of different, let's call them key agents or elements in the story. And one of these is the Earth itself, which in the beginning, in this first book, is, called Evil Earth, and there's a story that's being told here. According to legend, Father Earth did not originally hate life. In fact, as the lorists tell it, once upon a time, Earth did everything he could to facilitate the strange emergence of life on his surface. He crafted even, predictable seasons, kept changes of wind and wave and temperature slow enough that every living being could adapt, evolve, summoned waters that purified themselves, skies that always cleared after a storm. He did not create life, but that was happenstance, but he was pleased and fascinated by it, and proud to nurture such strange wild beauty upon his surface. Then people began to do horrible things to Father Earth. They poisoned waters beyond even his ability to cleanse, killed much of the other life that had lived on his surface. They drilled through the crust of his skin, past the blood of his mantle to get at the sweet marrow of his bones. And at the height of human hubris and might, it was the Origines who did something that even Earth could not forgive. They destroyed his only child. No lorist that Sayanet has ever talked to knows what this cryptic phrase means. It is in stone lore, just oral tradition occasionally recorded on ephemerals like paper and hide, and too many seasons have changed it. Sometimes it's the Earth's favorite glass knife that the Origines destroyed. Sometimes it's his shadow. Sometimes it's most valued breeder. Whatever the words mean, the Lorists and Mests agree on what happened after the Origines committed their great sin. Father Earth's surface cracked like an eggshell. Nearly every living thing died as his fury became manifest in the first and most terrible of the 5th seasons, the shattering season. Powerful as they were, those ancient people had no warning, no time to build store caches, no stone lore to guide them. It is only through sheer luck that enough of humankind survived to replenish itself afterwards, and never has life attained the heights of power that it once held. Earth's recurrent fury will never allow that. Cyanide has always wondered about these tales. There's a degree of poetic license in them, primitive people trying to explain what they didn't understand, but all legends contain a kernel of truth. Maybe the ancient Origins did shatter the planet's crust somehow. How, though? It's clear now that there's more to orogeny than what the Fulcrum teaches, and maybe there's a reason the Fulcrum doesn't teach it if the legends are true. But facts are facts. Even if somehow every origin in existence down to the infants could be yoked together, they could not destroy the world's surface. It would ice everything. There's not enough warmth or movement anywhere to do that much damage. They'd burn themselves out trying and die. Which means that part of the tale can't be true. Orogeny cannot be to blame for the Earth's rage. No, not that anyone but another Roga would accept this conclusion. Now, what was the real story? Well, we're going to find this out as we go along. And Alabaster is going to be the one who will say, it was the moon. The moon, which every once in a while comes back, was the Earth's child, and taking it away, as well as drilling into the Earth to try to suck out, the power from it. That is what turned the Earth against human beings. It wasn't Rogas, Origins, who actually did that. It was the tuners who are combining orogeny and magic in a way that both Essen and Nassun are going to be able to do as well through, and now here we get another really important element of the story, the obelisks. And what is the obelisk gate? Well, it's when you connect all of these up together, these giant floating crystals that have incredible power that, Essen, as Sayanite, is able to connect to early on in her story, but later on in the 5th season. It turns out that all of these obelisks can be brought into a network. And that is actually what Essen does to turn every single person in the calm that is attacking them into stone, right? And it requires incredible power. And it turns out that Nassun is able to access this gate as well. And we're going to have a rivalry between the two of them over whose vision of what to do is going to control things. So the obelisks themselves are incredibly powerful artifacts, tools, repositories of life and its possibilities. And they are used originally by the first tuners, who are going to become the Stone Eaters to produce this cataclysm within the Earth. And it throws the moon away as a result. And we get Alabaster telling us some things to Essen that are quite important. So he says, we use the obelisks to stills. They're just big, strange rocks. That city, those wonders, that dead civ was run by Origins. We destroyed the world just like they always said we did, Rogas. What they got wrong are the loyalties. The stories say we're agents of Father Earth, but it's the opposite. We're his enemies. He hates us more than he hates the stills because of what we did. That's why he made the Guardians to control us. The Guardians are also an artifact of this interplay between human beings and Father Earth. And then she says, Baster, you're talking as if the planet is real, alive, aware, all that stuff about Father Earth. It's just stories to explain what's wrong with the world, like those weird cults that crop up from time to time. I heard of one that asks an old man in the sky to keep them alive every time they go to sleep. People need to believe there's more to the world than there is. And the world is just shit. You understand this now after 2 dead children and the repeated destruction of your life. There's no need to imagine the planet as some malevolent force seeking vengeance. It's a rock. This is how life is supposed to be. Terrible and brief and ending, if you're lucky, oblivion. So she's saying, this is just anthropomorphism. This is what people do. And then we get the real kick in the pants. Alabaster says, no, actually, there is an Earth that is sentient and living and incredibly powerful. And there are also these stone eaters that are involved in a 3-sided war. Right? It says all 3 sides want the war to end. It's just a question of how. We're the problem, people. 2 of the sides are deciding what should be done with us. The phrasing explains a lot. The Earth and the stone eaters, no, they're people too, and haven't you figured that out? They need things, want things, feel things the same way that we do. And they've been fighting this war much, much longer than you or I, some of them from the very beginning. They're over 30,000 years old, right? And she asks, well, so what are these 3 sides? And Alabaster is going to reveal this. And he tells about this story that he's going into. There's this war that has been going on for a very, very long time. And the Stone Eaters are part of this. And, one of the sides is about just destroying humanity. Another is about peaceful coexistence, right? And the key to it is going to be getting the moon back. Bringing the moon, using the obelisk gate, back for Father Earth. So he says, the 3rd faction are those who want a truce people and Father Earth agreeing to tolerate one another, even if it means creating the rift and killing millions in the process. Peaceful coexistence by any means necessary. Right? So that's sort of their mission there. And, we find out a few other interesting things. The Guardians are, in fact, there not just to control the origins, but as agents of Father Earth. And we find that Nasun is actually able to hear Father Earth as they're moving down into the mantle. When the Earth speaks, it does not do so in words exactly. This is a thing you know already, but that Nasun only learns in this moment. She assesses the meanings, hears the vibrations with the bones of her ears, shudders them out through her skin, feels them pull tears from her eyes. It is like drowning in energy and sensation and emotion. It hurts. Remember, the Earth wants to kill her. But remember, too, Nasun wants it just as dead. So it says in microshakes that will eventually stir a tsunami somewhere in the southern hemisphere. Hello, little enemy. This is something that the Earth says to several people. This is an approximation, all that her young mind can bear. And she shouts at the Earth, you let him go. You let him go right now, about Shafa, the guardian. The core of the world is metal, molten and yet crushed into solidity. There is some malleability to it. The surface of the red darkness begins to ripple and change as Nasun watches. Something appears that for an instant she cannot parse. A pattern, familiar, a face. It is just the suggestion of a person, eyes and a mouth, shadow of a nose, but then for an instant the eyes are distinct in shape, the lips lined and detailed, a mole appearing beneath the eyes which open. No one she knows, just a face where there should be none. Again, the Earth is able to communicate. The Earth actually talks about obligation. What was stolen or lent must be recompensed. And then there's another interesting thing here. Nasun cannot help but understand that within the earth's embrace, which is with its meaning thrumming through her bones, the silver magic, it comes from life. Those who made the obelisk sought to harness magic, and they succeeded. Oh, how they succeeded. They used it to build wonders beyond imagining, but then they wanted more magic than just what their own lives or the accumulated eons of life and death on Earth's surface could provide, and they saw how much magic brimmed just beneath that surface, rife for the taking. It may have never occurred to them that so much magic, so much life might be indicator of awareness. The earth does not speak in words, after all, and perhaps Nasun realizes. Perhaps these builders of the great obelisk network were not used to respecting lives different from their own. Not really different from the people who run the fulcrums or raiders or her father. So where they should have seen a living being, they saw only another thing to exploit. Where they should have asked or left alone, they raped. For some crimes, there's no fitting justice, only reparation. And so we go on from that. And what we're going to find by the end of the Obelisk Gate is a struggle between Nasun, who's got this bleak, nihilistic attitude, and actually thinks, let's just turn everybody into stone and end the life of everything on the earth now. And her mother, Esun, who is trying to do something more human-oriented, let's say, in order to save her own daughter, too, to bring the moon back, to give Father Earth back something that he has been desiring, his missing child, and to bring about this truce. And that is what she, in fact, succeeds in doing, and that brings things to a undetermined but satisfactory resolution of sorts to this wonderful trilogy of works. And so here is where we end this examination of N.K. Jemisin's The Broken Earth trilogy.